Father sold his pregnant fat daughter to Mountain Man as punishment, but what he did to her. 50 silver dollars, Jeremiah Crawford said coldly, his voice slicing through the heavy air of his farmhouse kitchen. Take her, and she's yours. The man across the table, Matthias Blackthorne, lifted his gaze slowly. The lamplight caught the scar running across his jaw, and his eyes, blue and steady as ice, locked on the trembling girl standing behind her father. She was Esther Crawford, 19 years old and 5 months pregnant. Her cheeks were wet with tears. Her hands clutched the hem of her dress. Her father's words rang in her ears like a curse. "She's brought shame to my name," Jeremiah spat, pacing. "No man in Millbrook will have her now. Maybe a mountain hermit like you can make use of her. A servant, a cook, whatever you please. She's heavy, she's useless, but she'll work off her debt." Esther's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. She wasn't even allowed to speak in her defense. Matthias leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what's her debt exactly?" Jeremiah smirked. "Her existence." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then Matthias reached into his coat pocket, drew out a leather pouch, and let the silver coins clatter onto the table. "I'll take her," he said. Jeremiah grinned, satisfied, extending a hand. But Matthias didn't shake it. He simply stood, walked to Esther, and opened the door. "Come," he said softly. Esther hesitated, confused, frightened. "You're taking me?" Matthias looked back at Jeremiah with quiet disgust. "Not as a servant," he said, "as a free woman." Then, without another word, he led her out into the snowstorm. The door slammed shut behind them, ending one life and beginning another. The snow fell harder as they left the town of Millbrook behind. The road twisted upward toward the dark outline of the Rocky Ridge Mountains, where only the brave or the broken chose to live. Esther Crawford walked behind Matthias Blackthorne, clutching her small bundle of clothes. Her heavy skirts dragged through the snow, and her breath came in white clouds. Every few steps she stumbled. "Slow down," she murmured, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Matthias stopped and turned. His fur-lined coat was dusted with frost, but his eyes were gentle. "You can't keep walking like that. You'll freeze." He took off his gloves, handed them to her, then shrugged off his heavy cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth startled her. It smelled of pine smoke and iron, of a life spent working with his hands. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly. She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "My father said you bought me." Matthias's jaw tightened. "No," he said simply. "I paid to set you free. That man sold shame, not a daughter." His words stunned her. No one had ever spoken about her that way, not with dignity, not as if she mattered. The journey to the cabin took hours. By the time they reached it, the storm had turned the world white. The small log house sat at the edge of a frozen meadow, smoke curling from its chimney like a promise. Matthias opened the door, letting her step into a world of warmth and wood fire. Inside was simple but clean. A table, a sturdy bed, shelves lined with books and small carvings. "You'll sleep here," he said, pointing to the bed. Esther shook her head. "That's yours." He looked at her, his voice firm but kind. "It's ours, until I can build another." Tears stung her eyes again. She wasn't used to kindness, especially from a man like him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. The kind of man people whispered about in town. They said Matthias Blackthorne had lost his wife and child in a fire years ago. Since then, he'd buried his heart under layers of solitude and steel. That night, she sat by the fire while he chopped wood outside. The baby kicked gently beneath her hand, as if to remind her it was still there, still alive. When Matthias came in, snow clinging to his beard, he poured 2 mugs of tea and sat across from her. "You've got someone waiting for you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No one." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll stay here until you're strong. The mountain doesn't forgive weakness, but it protects the ones who respect it." Esther hesitated, then whispered, "Why help me?" He stared into the flames for a long moment. "Because someone should have helped my wife, and no one did." The room went silent, the fire crackling between them. Esther didn't know what to say. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a burden. That night, as the wind howled outside, she fell asleep under a thick blanket that smelled of cedar and safety. Matthias sat awake in the next room, staring into the dark, realizing something he hadn't felt in years. Hope had walked back into his home, wearing a torn dress and carrying a beating heart he wanted to protect. The days on Rocky Ridge were long, cold, and strangely healing. Snow blanketed the pines like silence itself, and the air tasted clean, too clean for someone who had spent her life breathing the dust of town and humiliation. At first, Esther struggled. Her body, already heavy from pregnancy, wasn't built for the climb to the stream or the rhythm of chopping and hauling. But Matthias never scolded her. He moved beside her like a steady wind, helping without taking away her dignity. "Lean on me," he said once as she slipped on the icy path. His voice wasn't an order. It was permission to stop pretending she could survive alone. Every morning, Matthias woke before dawn to stoke the fire and prepare porridge. He never touched her food until she'd eaten first. When she tried to help him split logs or fetch water, he watched quietly, but always kept close, ready to catch her if she fell. The cabin soon became a rhythm of shared silence, her humming while she mended his shirts, his hammer striking the anvil in the yard, each echo a heartbeat of their new life. At night, they sat near the hearth. Matthias would carve small toys from pine wood, birds, horses, stars, and leave them on the windowsill. One night, Esther picked one up and smiled. "For the baby?" He nodded. "She'll need something to hold when the wind howls." "She?" Esther asked softly. Matthias shrugged. "Call it a guess." As the snow melted and spring crept up the mountain, Esther's belly grew heavy, and so did her fear. Sometimes she woke crying from nightmares of her father, his words still echoing, useless, shameful, sold. One dawn, Matthias found her sitting outside, trembling in the mist. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "I keep hearing him. I keep thinking I don't deserve this place or your kindness." Matthias knelt beside her. "That man gave you away because he couldn't see your worth. That's his blindness, not yours." Her lips quivered. "You talk like you believe I can be more than a mistake." He looked at her for a long moment. "You already are." From that day, something shifted. Esther began to laugh again, quietly at first, then freely. She cleaned the cabin, baked bread, tended to a small garden Matthias built for her behind the forge. Her laughter became the new music of Rocky Ridge. One afternoon, while Matthias was working in the forge, she brought him lunch. He turned and caught her watching him, his broad back glistening with sweat, sparks flying as he shaped iron into form. "You shouldn't be standing there," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Why?" she teased. He met her eyes. "Because when you look at me like that, I forget what I'm doing." Color bloomed across her cheeks. She set down the basket, unsure whether to laugh or cry. No man had ever said something so gentle, so disarming, without an ounce of cruelty. From that moment on, their silences carried warmth instead of distance. Weeks passed, and the snow melted into streams that sang through the valley. One evening, Matthias helped her climb the ridge behind the cabin. The sunset burned gold and crimson across the sky, and the whole world seemed to pause. "Why did you choose to live up here?" she asked. He stared toward the horizon. "Because it's quiet enough to hear the truth." "What truth?" "That no one stays broken forever," he said, turning to her. "Not if someone cares enough to help them heal." The wind rose gently, tugging at her hair. She wanted to tell him that he was the one who had healed her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. For the first time, the mountain didn't feel lonely. It felt like a promise. Spring arrived gently on Rocky Ridge, and with it came a new rhythm, one that felt almost sacred. For the first time in her life, Esther Crawford awoke to peace instead of shouting. The cabin smelled of pine and freshly baked bread. Sunlight pooled across the wooden floor, and outside, the forest was alive with the hum of renewal. She had grown rounder now, the baby inside her shifting like a small secret heartbeat. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, patching Matthias's shirts, or knitting tiny socks by the fire. But it wasn't work born from duty. It was love disguised as motion. Matthias Blackthorne had built her a garden at the back of the cabin. He'd tilled the soil himself, guiding her gently when she wanted to help. Together, they planted potatoes, carrots, herbs, and rows of lavender to calm the spirit, as he said. Every evening, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, they'd sit on the porch steps. Matthias would hand her a mug of warm milk sweetened with honey, and Esther would rest her head against his shoulder, listening to the world soften. "You're quiet tonight," he'd murmur. "I'm thinking about the baby," she'd whisper. "Do you ever wonder who she'll look like?" He smiled faintly. "I hope she has your eyes." "And your heart," she replied. He looked away quickly, pretending not to blush under his beard. Inside the cabin, life unfolded in the small miracles of ordinary days. When a storm came one night and thunder shook the valley, Matthias moved her bed closer to the fire and stayed awake beside her, feeding the flames until dawn. When her ankles swelled, he carved a small footrest and massaged her feet with warm oil, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. When she felt the baby kick for the first time, he dropped his hammer mid-strike just to kneel beside her, eyes wide with wonder. "It's real," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Of course she's real." Esther laughed through tears. "No," he said softly. "I mean, it's real. This life. You. All of it." The firelight flickered over their faces as they looked at each other, and in that quiet moment, something unspoken bridged the years of loneliness between them. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the town, delivered by a trapper passing through. Esther froze when she saw the handwriting. "My father," she said faintly. Matthias's expression hardened. "You don't have to read it." But she did. Her father's words were cruel and bitter. He accused her of shame, of sin, of ruining his name. He wrote that if she had any decency left, she'd keep away from town forever. The letter slipped from her hands. I don't understand how he can hate me this much. Matthias stepped forward, taking her trembling fingers in his. Because he's too small to understand love. She looked up at him, tears welling. And you? Why do you? He hesitated, then said quietly, Because I've lost it once. I know what it costs to be given a second chance. That night, while she slept, Matthias sat by the fire carving again. This time, it wasn't a bird or a star. It was a tiny cradle, each detail crafted with the precision of a man building hope. When Esther found it the next morning, she pressed her hands to her mouth and wept. As summer ripened, her belly grew heavy and the nights restless. Still, Matthias was there, steady as the mountain itself. He learned how to boil water, sterilize cloth, mix herbal teas. When she asked how he knew these things, he smiled sadly. You'd be surprised what a man learns when he's loved and lost. One late evening, as the sun melted into amber light, Esther caught him staring at her. What is it? She asked. He shook his head slowly. You glow, he said simply, like the world finally remembered how to be kind. She laughed, embarrassed. You should rest. You work too hard. He rose, brushing the soot from his hands. I'll rest when you and that little one are safe. Until then, the forge keeps burning. She watched him disappear into the workshop, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing through the trees. And as she sat there, one hand on her belly, the other tracing the cradle's smooth wooden edge, she realized something profound. This man, this mountain, this quiet life, it was no longer her refuge. It was her home. Autumn swept over Rocky Ridge like a sigh, soft winds, golden leaves, and a peace that felt too good to last. Esther's baby was due in a few weeks. The garden shimmered with ripened pumpkins, and the smell of pine smoke curled gently from the cabin's chimney. But peace in the mountains is fragile. It trembles when old ghosts begin to stir. That ghost arrived one gray morning, riding a black horse and carrying a sneer that curdled the air. Jeremiah Crawford. Esther froze when she saw her father step off the horse, brushing dust from his coat as if he still owned the ground he stood on. Well, well, Jeremiah said, eyeing her swollen belly. You've been busy, girl. Before Esther could speak, Matthias Blackthorne stepped out of the workshop, his hammer still in hand. His voice was low, like distant thunder. You're not welcome here. Jeremiah ignored him, looking around. So this is where my daughter lives now? Out here with a blacksmith pretending to be her husband? Esther's face flushed with anger. You sold me, Father. You gave me away like an animal. Jeremiah smirked. Correction, I loaned you. You think I'd let my own flesh belong to a man like him for good? You've got something that belongs to me now. Matthias stepped forward. Say it, old man. What is it you think you own? Jeremiah jabbed a finger toward Esther's belly. That child, my bloodline, my legacy. The air went still. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Matthias's grip tightened around the hammer. You forfeited every right the day you sold her. And that baby? She's not yours to claim. Jeremiah's grin twisted. We'll see what the law says. Folks in town still think you're dangerous, Blackthorne. They whisper you bought her like cattle. I could ruin you with a few words. Esther stepped forward, trembling but fierce. Do it then. Tell them. Tell everyone you sold your pregnant daughter for $50 silver. See who they'll believe. For a moment, Jeremiah's face cracked, his confidence slipping under the weight of her voice. But cruelty was the only language he knew. "You'll regret talking to me like that, girl." Matthias moved between them, his voice steady, but shaking with restrained fury. "If you ever threaten her again, Jeremiah, I'll stop being polite." Jeremiah narrowed his eyes. "You think you can hide from justice up here forever? I'll bring the sheriff. You'll hang for what you did." "Then bring him," Matthias said, "but make sure he knows why you're really here." Jeremiah hesitated, then spat on the ground and turned toward his horse. "This isn't over." When he disappeared down the trail, Esther's knees gave out. Matthias caught her before she hit the ground. "He'll come back," she whispered. "He'll ruin everything." Matthias brushed her hair away from her damp cheeks. "No," he said firmly, "he won't." That night he saddled his horse and rode into Millbrook under the cover of darkness. When he returned at dawn, his coat was dusted with frost and victory. "What did you do?" she asked, half afraid of the answer. He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Filed an affidavit with Judge Thompson. It declares what happened the day I met your father, that I paid his silver to release you, not to own you. It's witnessed, signed, and sealed. He can't touch you now." Tears filled her eyes. "You went to the law? For me?" "For us," he corrected gently. Then, after a pause, "I also told them if Jeremiah Crawford sets foot on this mountain again, he'll be arrested for trafficking his own daughter." Esther stared at him astonished. "You risked everything." Matthias shook his head. "I just stopped running from the past." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the fire crackle and the soft breathing of the man who had saved her twice, once from the cold and now from the world that had broken her. Outside, the wind carried away the last of the autumn leaves. Inside, hope burned quietly, fierce as the forge in Matthias's heart. The storm came the same night Jeremiah returned. Thunder rolled through Rocky Ridge like an omen, lightning flashing across the valley. Esther felt the baby shift uneasily inside her as wind battered the cabin walls. Then, hoofbeats, dozens of them. Matthias was already at the door, rifle in hand, when a voice shouted from outside, "Matthias Blackthorne! By order of the Millbrook sheriff, open up!" Esther's heart stopped. She saw the flicker of torchlight through the window, men in the rain, their shadows long and trembling. Jeremiah stood among them, smirking beneath his soaked hat. "You said it was over?" Esther whispered. Matthias's jaw clenched. "It will be." He opened the door slowly. The sheriff, a lean man with gray hair and tired eyes, raised his hand. "Matthias, I got a report of unlawful purchase of a woman. I don't want trouble, but the law's the law." Jeremiah stepped forward triumphantly. "You see, Sheriff, he bought her. $50 silver for a pregnant girl. The man's filth." Matthias said nothing. He turned, walked to the shelf, and pulled out a sealed envelope, the one Judge Thompson had signed. He handed it to the sheriff. "Read it," Matthias said. The sheriff frowned, opened the document under his lantern, and began to read aloud. "I, Matthias Blackthorne, of Rocky Ridge, do hereby swear that I paid Jeremiah Crawford $50 silver to free his daughter Esther Crawford from unlawful servitude and mistreatment." The sheriff's eyes lifted slowly. "You signed this?" "I did," Matthias said, "and the judge witnessed it himself." Jeremiah's face blanched. "He's lying." "Enough," the sheriff snapped. "I've known Judge Thompson 20 years. If he signed this, it's done." The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Lightning split the sky. "You sold your own daughter," the sheriff said coldly. "You ought to thank God he doesn't hang you for it." Jeremiah's voice shook with fury. "You can't take her from me. She was never yours," Matthias said, stepping closer. Jeremiah swung toward him, hand twitching toward the revolver at his belt, but before he could draw, Matthias grabbed him by the wrist, iron meeting bone, and twisted until Jeremiah screamed. The gun clattered to the ground. "You hurt her once," Matthias growled, his voice like gravel and fire. "You'll never touch her or this child again." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Get him out of here." Two deputies hauled Jeremiah toward his horse. As they vanished into the rain, Matthias turned back to Esther. She was standing in the doorway, her hands pressed to her belly, tears streaking her face. "It's over," he said softly. She shook her head, smiling through the tears. "No, it's beginning." He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. Outside, thunder still rolled through the valley, but inside the cabin the world finally exhaled. That night, as the storm faded into dawn, the first cry of their baby girl rose into the mountain air, pure, strong, and alive, the sound of a new life, the sound of redemption. When spring finally came to Rocky Ridge, it carried with it a peace so deep it felt almost holy. The snow melted into silver streams, wildflowers burst through the soil, and the cries of their newborn daughter filled the valley like birdsong. Esther Crawford, no longer trembling or afraid, sat on the porch with the baby bundled in her arms. Her cheeks glowed in the golden light. Matthias Blackthorne was nearby, sanding the cradle he had carved during the long winter. Each stroke of his hand was slow and careful, as if shaping not wood, but a prayer. "She likes your voice," Esther said softly, smiling as the baby cooed. Matthias chuckled, setting down the sandpaper. "Then she's the only one who ever did." Esther looked up at him, her eyes bright. "That's not true." He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, smiled without sorrow. "No, I suppose not any more." The next Sunday, the small church in Millbrook filled with whispers as word spread that the mountain blacksmith had come down, with his wife and child. Esther wore a simple white dress and carried their baby. Her father's name was never spoken nor needed. When the pastor asked if Matthias took Esther to be his wife, he answered, "I already have." The congregation laughed softly, and Esther's tears sparkled as she said, "And I already am." Outside the bells rang, while the townspeople gathered to watch them walk hand in hand down the dirt road, sunlight spilling like forgiveness across their faces. Back on the mountain, the forge burned steady again. The hammer's rhythm mingled with laughter, the cry of their child, and the song of the wind. They had survived cruelty. They had built a home from mercy, and on Rocky Ridge, love had the final word. Sometimes love doesn't arrive as a fairy tale. It walks through storms carrying scars and chooses to stay anyway. Esther's story reminds us that freedom begins the moment someone decides you are worth saving, and healing begins when you finally believe them. Matthias didn't rescue her because she was weak. He loved her because she was strong enough to start again. If this story touched your heart tonight, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Because no matter how far apart we are, we all share the same hope. That love, in its quietest form, can rewrite any destiny.